can a lover go but to the land of his beloved? And what seeker findeth rest away from his heart's desire?
Yeah, it's when you spend time sort of reading about all these wonderful people, especially all these ladies, and how they understood the faith and how close they were to Abdu'l-Baha, and how firm and how devoted. And I mean, first of all, it's such a great feeling to be surrounded by all these wonderful Baha'is. You kind of I don't know, you kind of wish they were still here. So we're going to have to find Baha'is that were as devoted and as involved and as I don't know what to say. Dorothy Baker used to talk to people and sort of make sure that they became serious Baha'is, devoted.
Wow.
Not mediocre Baha'is, she says. Very, very, very strange. It's like it's all about. I guess part of it is prayer. She just prayed and prayed and prayed. It's incredible. It's hard to see many people that pray as much as someone like her prayed. Anyway, you sort of wonder if it was because they were so close to Abdu'l-Baha and Shakti Effendi that made the faith very personal. They were attached to a single individual. Now we don't have a single individual, we have an institution, a house of justice. Different to relate, because you cannot relate to members of the house as individuals. You can love them, but it's not the same thing. But that was the time. So anyway, I'm going to be sort of a little bit reading from, I suggest you, if you haven't read it, get a copy of it from Copper to Gold. It's really wonderful. It's a biography written by someone close to the family with the contribution of the daughter of Dorothy Baker. But I'm going to be reading from another book that summarized their stories of Getzinger and Maxwell and Martha Root and Keith Ransom Keller, written by Janet Rue Sean. So I'm going to be using that and then going back and forth when fishing for details. I'm going to go back to From Copper to Gold. So,
c'est bon, tu peux commencer.
Okay. Welcome, Pauline. Hi. And Elsabeti, wonderful. Just ladies, except John and I were the only men here, which is normal because we are talking about ladies most of the time here. So, Dorothy Baker must have been born in 1890, but these books don't talk much about her birth, the date, but they come back to 1912. That's the day that she was 12 years old, 1912. She must have been born in close to 1900. She was 12 years old. Her grandmother took her to see Abdu'l-Baha. So it all started there. She was a very shy girl. She was the granddaughter of Mother Beecher, who was an amazing teacher, well known in the US. And so she would often dream of her parents, Dorothy. But her parents, Luella and Henry was the son of, was a lawyer, was the son of Mother Beecher. They was always fighting. Plus, he was a tough guy, he was a lawyer, the father. and was not. I think he became a Baha'i eventually, but it was very tough and very strict, and they were not very spiritual. And so the girl was sort of torn between her father and her grandmother, who was basically into mysticism and who became a Baha'i very way back and was an active teacher. So her parents used to fight a lot, and so she was torn between that kind of home life and her grandmother. So as she grew older, she learned to recognize the subtle but harsh words that aggravated their discontent. It is in it she walked along between the two of them, father and mother, in her dream. She would dream that she was holding their hands and concentrating to pull them together, the father Henry and his wife Luella. But no matter how she strained, by the end of the dream, Dorothy grew too weak and she couldn't bring them together. So they would be drifting apart. So the dream frightened Dorothy. Her power seemed so limited. So she figured if Henry was right, her father, that all strength comes from within the individual, she knew she was right to be afraid. Neither she nor either of her parents seemed able to mend their torn family. But Dorothy felt more at ease when she went to bed, convinced that her father was misled and her grandmother understood the truth. God, she believed, is all good and all powerful. So she found comfort in her grandmother's perception of reality until one night, lying under the white sheets, Dorothy felt the paralyzing fear of some tremendous and noble force at work in the universe and in herself. Anxiety about her family's inharmony, even about her own limited power, counted as nothing in the face of this fear. The interminable universe drew closer, surrounded her, until even her little bed was part of it. She felt suspended on the very edge of the earth and could feel it turning in an endless void at the mercy of an all-encompassing God she could not comprehend. So a few days after that night of fear, Dorothy sat with Mother Beecher in the carriage that took them toward New York. Mother Beecher spoke of God and his messengers, of the luminous Christ-like man they were soon to meet. Dorothy's last experience with God was still too vivid to allow her to listen with anything but politeness. So as the carriage pulled into the drive of a house Dorothy had never seen before, that same fear unannounced came rushing into her heart. The door opened and her grandmother stepped out. Dorothy didn't move. She knew that Abdu'l-Baha was there, she was told. So what if he looks at me, she thought. If he speaks of me, I will die. So when they went inside, there were groups of people around the room still talking quietly among themselves. But the attention of each heart was no doubt centered on Abdu'l-Baha. He could have done little to increase the reverent attitude of the assembled Baha'is, even if they had known that during the following months of his American visit, the man about to address them would be sought after by leaders in every arena, like J.P. Morgan, Alexander Graham Bell, and Theodore Roosevelt. So the effect of Abdu'l-Baha, loving and radiant nature, needed no proof beyond the transformed feelings of the heart that was near him. A Christian clergyman who also met Abdu'l-Baha later wrote, "One could not be in his presence more than a few moments without realizing that his very act, tone, gesture, word was so imbued with wisdom, courage, and tranquil certitude, combined with such humble consideration of his interlocutor, that conclusive truth was conveyed to every beholder and listener." So Abdu'l-Baha turned his majestic head towards the door as more people entered. He smiled at Ellen Beecher, the woman he had addressed as Mother Beecher 2 months before, and motioned the child with her to a footstool next to him, his chair. Dorothy, without looking up from the floor, stepped around the people who had by now circled Abdu'l-Baha. And as Abdu'l-Baha continued to speak, she sat on the stool near him, but kept her eyes on her own little black shoe. Now, Abdu'l-Baha did not look at her, nor did she dare even glance at him. Instead, Dorothy tried to concentrate on the folds of her leggings, hoping they would keep her from falling into the dimension of the unknown, hoping they remind her the world was real and she was real. But instead of feeling transferred from fear of some immense unknown to the comfortable acceptance of life, Dorothy's fear changed to desperate longing, a longing that felt strange but familiar. Now she felt again the same intense, overpowering urge for the harmony of united love that exhausted her young heart when she dreamed of her parents. She felt that longing no more for them, but for herself. Dorothy yearned in the presence of Abdu'l-Baha for her own soul to be lost in the immensity of his love, melted into the luminous presence that surrounded her. Now, when Abdu'l-Baha finished speaking, Dorothy, unaware that she had even moved, found herself turned toward him, elbows on her knees, chin in hands, unwilling and unable to remove her gaze from his face. Dorothy could never remember the subject of Abdu'l-Baha's talk that day, but for days after, she could think of nothing but that face, that voice. Finally, no longer able to suffer her love alone, she wrote Abdu'l-Baha, begging to be allowed to serve him and the cause of his father, Baha'u'llah. She signed her letter, "Your little follower, Dorothy Beecher." On the second page of her letter, she received an answer written in his own hand. "Dearest child, your goal is great and God is all bountiful. My hope is this, that you succeed in your desire." So before his time in New York came to an end, Abdu'l-Baha sent a message to Mother Beecher, asking her to visit him. When she entered the room where he and a number of Baha'is stood talking, Abdu'l-Baha turned toward her and the room went silent. "I have called you to say that your granddaughter, your grandchild, is my own daughter. You must train her for me." So that's how the story begins. The grandmother, who was so busy teaching and traveling all over the place, until she was 90 something, she just never stopped. She had this assignment from Abdu'l-Baha that she should take care of her daughter. So, let me just now continue and not lose my pages. So the mother, the grandmother Ellen, was the only Baha'i in the family, the only religious person in the family. Although her husband, through her husband, she was connected to the Beechers, the famous family of male Christian preachers and orators. And the only famous member of the family was Harriet Beecher Stowe, who was the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin. So, she was a very bright student. She was a high achiever. At 16, she convinced her father to let her take her senior year of high school at Northfield, a fine boarding academy. She was interested in academics, but her father only cared for her to learn etiquette and housekeeping. She graduated with honors and announced that she wanted to study law. Now, there's a very interesting dialogue with the father. When she was trying to go to his office and visit to see exactly how she was, how lawyers work. So he was saying that she was very proud of her, and so on. But he said, yes, but I want you to be even prouder when I graduate from law school. And he says, no, this is not going to happen. He said, you can't do that. So he tried to convince her not to go down that path. He says that would make her very, would lean either towards be forgiving to people or being very harsh towards people as a lawyer, and he didn't want her to. So he says he wanted to be a fine woman. She says, working as a lawyer is quite a different thing from being a star pupil at a boarding school. She says, I'm afraid of what will happen to you. You're so sensitive to the pain of other people. Either you will constantly, by suffering with them, or worse, you will become callous and tough. I couldn't stand to see either happen to you. Your sweetness would all but disappear. So she just, couldn't figure it out. She just wanted to be what she wanted to be. And he said, have a think about it, what I've said. If you don't already realize I'm right, perhaps considering the consequences in your life will convince you. So she watched her father go down the steps and go to his office. She closed her eyes and thought about it. And that night, she told her father his decision would stand. She told herself that whatever she wanted would have to wait for that first objective to be fulfilled, to become the kind of woman a man like her father would love. So she had to abandon that path and go into teacher training. So during that time, of course, all these years, as she was traveling, she would write to her all the time to basically help her and coach her and teach her, her grandmother. And she would tell her things like, do not forget that God has appointed a center of his covenant with man. And that center, Abdu'l-Baha, is Abdu'l-Baha, and he has chosen you as his daughter. And that means much more than it would mean to have the greatest earthly king adopt you as his very own. One is eternal, one makes you one with God, and the other has no power to go with you, or to love your soul, or to make you happy in or of yourself. And, when you read what her classmates thought of her, she was really somebody that everybody loved. And she was so kind and nice that nobody close to her would even think of saying anything kind of nasty about her. I mean, she was even into hypnotics. She would hypnotize her classmates. She was into all kinds of things at the time because she was had not yet become an active Baha'i and gone out into the world and give talks and all that. So she was just very involved with her friends, and the people just loved her. So after graduating from this school in 1920, she taught grade school. She was the belle of her circle of friends, with an ethereal and piquant beauty, a robust good humor, and a streak of daring. She was also the belle of her classroom of 7- and 8-year-old students in Newark slum. They came from such poor families that the mothers, many of them were immigrants who knew no English. And Dorothy would sing to them children's songs and pop hits to them, and they were fascinated with her wardrobe, especially one outfit consisting of a hot pink blouse and an orange skirt. They had trouble reciting the names of the colors from a color chart, but they shouted out the names when asked to identify what Miss Beecher was wearing. She was very well known for her clothing. So Dorothy was skipping all these little marks on all these books. Excuse me. She tried to get a job, and so what she did is she found a summer job in a munitions factory in Delaware, in Dover, New Jersey. So she was trying to, this is during the war. She tried to, do good. So she tried hard to settle into her routine of her job as a bomb inspector. So when she was working and whatever people do to assemble the bombs, at one point, she looked at one of the girls that was in front of her. And there was something kind of funny about that girl, what she was doing in terms of, she realized that her desk was a little bit messy. So she took a break and came back. She walked back to her station, her eyes everywhere, but she went to her place. And so instead of getting directly back to work, Dorothy cut around and walked behind the barricade separating their inspection group from the end of the plant. As she came around the corner, the woman's back became visible. Then the top half of her torso disappeared from sight as she leaned far over her workbench. She thought that she was very thorough. So not wanting to interrupt in the middle of an inspection, she stood still just the other side of the barricade and waited for her coworker to finish. After a minute or two, Dorothy began to wonder if there was some problem. So peering around the movable shelves, she saw the woman's hand inside the bomb. Then the other hand slipped under her work table and pulled out something long. But she moved so quickly, Dorothy wasn't sure what. By the flash of light reflected, it looked like a knitting needle. So whatever it was now lodged inside the bomb. And the bomb was set alongside the others that had been inspected and approved. So she went back to the table, couldn't decide what she had seen. So her quiet explanation to the plant supervisor at the end of the day was given mainly to free her mind to pass on the information that someone qualified to decide if it was nothing that she saw. So instead, the discovery received national attention. A knitting needle properly placed would apparently make certain bombs the plant manufactured malfunction. So the President of the United States, Woodrow Wilson, sent a letter to Dorothy in commendation for the discovery of an enemy agent. So here she is, she's not doing any Baha'i work yet, and she finds this thing and she gets a letter from the president. And then she was torn between, like what she found was good because the bomb, wasn't going to explode, and so it wasn't going to kill people. On the other hand, now that she fixed it, that bomb was going to kill people. So she didn't know what this civilization was about, because whatever you do, it was something you were doing was not right. Anyway, so through that period, she it's the time to look for her husband and all that. And she met a lawyer, a law student that really was really liked her, and she was involved with him. And at the last minute, decided to cancel that. It seemed like that that marriage was something that was going to get her involved in a different kind of life, that she was going to be like a bourgeois, was going to have a life with kids and be involved in social activities. And she realized that that's not really what she needed. And so let me tell you what happened there. So it was a young Boston lawyer, and she was very attracted to this man. So she asked to marry him, and she basically told him no. So she didn't quite know what she said no, because it was something that was not right. And so when she was living in a boarding place, a couple of little kids used to come around and were very attached to her. Both, the boy name was Conrad and the daughter was Sarah. And their father, a certain Frank Baker, was an older man. He had lost his wife, and somehow wasn't quite paying attention to Dorothy, but through the kids and through that contact and so on, finally they went out for dinner, and he asked her to marry him, and she accepted, and she married Frank, whose background was German Lutheran, and that's it. That she made that decision, and that decision turned out to be, of course, for the best, because this man allowed her to serve the faith for the rest of her life, because he loved her, and he became a Baha'i, and he was able to allow her to fulfill her potential and be able to do everything that she had to do, because she was, for the rest of her life, she was gone most of the time for administrative duty, for teaching trips, speaking in universities. I mean, she was gone most of the time. He would tell Mr. Furutan, when Mr. Furutan asked him eventually, how was life with Dorothy? He says that he cherished the moments when he would come home, because all he would do is just help her unpack and then help her pack again, because she was gone all the time. So, but when she was, she knew that she was extremely involved in the faith, but she knew she had to basically divide her time between her service to the faith and her family, her kids, and recreation. I mean, she knew that she couldn't just be doing 100%. But she was so close to the family that there's stories where she would, when things went wrong with the kids, she would know about it. There's an incident when one of the kids was sick. There was a little fight between the daughter and her father, and she had to go to her room, and she said, "I hate my father." And at that very moment, Dorothy called the house, was able to speak to her and to the father, and she had sensed that something was wrong. She had seen in a dream that the girl was falling. Actually, she had something had dropped from the table, but she imagined the girl had fallen from somewhere. She called the house, and she was able to, by talking to them, resolve the issue. So even though she was gone, her contact with the family, because she's highly spiritual and she prayed a lot, she just didn't quite abandon her kids. So now that marriage was initially was very difficult for her, because the kids felt that now the father was more attached to Dorothy than to them, because she was the new mother. And so she had a tough time in first years of her marriage. She was hurting because of the kids' feelings towards her at first, and because of the money side. She was not earning money. She couldn't do what she wanted to do. She couldn't buy the clothes she used to buy when she was a teacher. She said if Dorothy's marriage seemed smooth and unruffled to friends and observers, it was because she and Frank were determined to solve any marital problems or else individually learn to accept the difficulties marriage presented. During the first year when they lived in Montclair, Dorothy was afraid to talk about money. Although Frank had a substantial income, he was into the bakery business and he was quite wealthy. And included in the monthly budget a $40 clothing allowance for each of the children. Dorothy felt it was impossible to ask for anything extra for herself. It may have been her strict puritanical upbringing that kept Dorothy from mentioning that the budget, which was initially meant only for keeping the house and children, was not sufficient. When she was single and the teacher, Dorothy had been able to buy a new dress whenever she wanted one, and now she couldn't. So the wedding gifts were elaborate and beautiful, but Dorothy didn't receive many practical things. The house was ill-stocked with only leftover and worn linens and household items from Frank's first marriage. It was in need for refurbishing, but Dorothy wouldn't ask for the funds. But Frank's generosity in other areas made Dorothy hesitate to mention mundane necessities. He prided himself on giving her her own car, but because she was so silent about her smaller, more immediate needs, extra money went to buy her the things Frank thought she wanted, like new golf clubs or dinner at posh restaurants. But I mean, she just didn't have what she wanted. Now, and on the side of the children, raising these two stepchildren was very difficult for her before she had two kids with him. During Dorothy's first year of marriage, Sarah and Conrad, the boy was older, sometimes treated her as an intruder, someone who was trying unsuccessfully to steal the affection they reserved for their real mother. The adjustment was particularly traumatic for Sarah, who was used to having the complete attention of both her father and her mother. Another female in the house, other than hired help, particularly following Sarah's exclusion from the honeymoon, she wasn't allowed to go to the honeymoon, made her moody. So gradually, however, the problems of the budget and the difficulties of being a stepmother were largely resolved, though not without tremendous strain on Dorothy. For months, she woke every morning to find her pillow wet and cold from the tears she had cried in her dreams. That's what the author said. Obviously, if the author wrote that, is they get the confidence from Dorothy or from her daughter. So that was the first few years of marriage. So her Baha'i activities really didn't start for quite a bit of time. She said she was adept at organizing her household, but she couldn't find time for anything else. She considered herself a Baha'i, though she tended to mix Baha'i ideas with others that had fascinated her since school days. While in Buffalo, she had Louise's and Billy's, the two kids that she had with Frank. She had Louise and Billy's astrological charts, as well as numerology readings done. So she was really involved in many things. It was Mother Beecher's visit that inspired a more active involvement in the faith. She encouraged Dorothy to accompany her to a Baha'i feast at the home of her friends Grace and Harlan Ober, outstanding Baha'is that had been married at the suggestion of and in the presence of Abdu'l-Baha in 1912. So Doris Mackay, who later pioneered to Prince Edward's Island, was then a fairly new Baha'i from Geneva, New York. So she wrote of meeting Dorothy one evening in Buffalo. She says, different people spoke, but only one did I remember. A young woman, tall, slim, and pale, with great gray eyes, arose and reminded us by a story she told that we were all children of God. She was wearing a wine velvet dress that set off her extreme pallor and delicacy. The impact of her personality was stunning. And this stunning business, how she spoke, her eloquence, how she dressed, had an impact on everybody throughout all her life. In Baha'i audiences and non-Baha'i audiences. So at one point, her children loved stories. So she was really busy teaching kids, reading kids stories. She says she would read classics to herself, like Les Misérables, for one, a chapter a day, then tell in serial form to her little audience. She included all kinds of other stories about Abdu'l-Baha's visit and so on and so forth. So Conrad, who turned 15 in the summer of 1926, and Sarah, now almost 13, were 10 years older than the two kids she had with Frank, Louise, and Billy. So they could follow stories better. When the renowned Persian diplomat and scholar, Dr. Ali Kuli Khan, spoke in Buffalo, Dorothy decided to take the older children. Dr. Khan lectured on the Seven Valleys, a mystical book, about the progress of the soul. So Dr. Conrad, the older boy, he could follow the story, the lecture. But Sarah was very quiet. So Dr. Khan took the audience through the first several of the mystically explained stages. And Dorothy noticed that Sarah, who had been sitting very straight, looking up at Dr. Khan, had now let her head drop low. She wondered if she might be asleep. So then noiselessly, Sarah lifted her head and the dark curtain of hair fell back. She looked at her mother through lashes clumped together like long grass after a shower, tears silent as the sudden thunderless rain of the tropics still streamed over her high, round cheekbones. That night, Dorothy had just tucked Sarah into bed and was closing the hall door when Sarah called her back. Muz, I just want you to know, no matter what, that I'm a Baha'i. She was 13. So a few weeks later, they were downtown shopping and all that, with taking care of Sarah. And Sarah complained that she's very tired. So instead of going back home, she took her right away to the hospital. So when the nurse called her name, she didn't stir. Went to the examining room. After a test, the doctor came back and told her that Sarah's white blood count is very high and her symptoms suggest leukemia, and that blood count supports the diagnosis. And as you know, he said leukemia is very serious, and in her case, is very acute. So he told her that it was acting very fast, and that Sarah could maybe live just a week longer. And so she called her husband, and the husband had already gone through the death of his mother, and then the death of his wife, Mary, the mother of the two kids. And now he was about to lose Sarah. So a nurse came to live with the family. Sarah was not told exactly why, but she knew she was ill. So So at one point, she wanted to see her family. Her parents were having dinner and the nurse called them. And they barely had time to come to see her. Sarah had difficulty talking, but she was able to express to them her love and to explain what she wanted done with her things. She says, yeah, I'm sorry. Excuse me, these phones are driving me crazy. She says she had difficulty speaking, but she was able to express to them her love, to explain what she wanted done with her things. Her dollhouse should go to Louise, and later that day, Sarah died. So you can imagine what happened to the family. So well into the night, Dorothy went to bed and opened her eyes. She had a vision. She says, a brilliant light illumined their bed. Pushing herself up on one elbow, she looked around the room to find the source of the light. Then noticed it was shining straight in through the window. The sky outside was dark. About to get up to close the curtain, Dorothy stopped. There, skipping down the path of light, came Sarah. In her hair, she wore garlands of vines and ivy and wildflowers. Over her arms were the plated handles of two large wicker baskets filled with more vines and flowers, especially violets. Sarah was smiling and danced toward Dorothy. Oh, Muz, I'm so happy. Look, I have all the wildflowers I want. She looked at her father, who lay sleeping beside Dorothy. In a voice soft with love and pity, she said, tell him I'm happy, Muz. Tell him how happy I am. Then she turned and danced back up the path of light. Dorothy woke Frank. By then, the light was fading. She told him what she had seen as the light faded, still more until they were alone again in the darkness. But the incident comforted her as it did Frank, with the knowledge that Sarah was living on somewhere and was happy. So about a month later, Dorothy was sat reading in the living room. The book was the Kitab-i-Ikan by Baha'u'llah. She finished one section and began to put it down. You know, this woman read, you have no idea how much she read and how much writing she did before she gave any talk. She would spend maybe 20 to 30 to 40 hours before she even said anything. And she was all the time reading. So she was reading the first section of Kitab-i-Ikan and began to put it down, then felt compelled to open the book again and slowly read over the last paragraph, concentrating on the meaning of the words. Again, she closed it, and as she did, she clearly heard Sarah's voice that said, thanks, Maz. That time, I got it. So the years in Buffalo, although they had seemed safe and secure at the start, led the Bakers towards the need to trust and active belief in something other than stability of physical life. They began hosting the Buffalo weekly Baha'i firesides. When the regular host, the Obers, were out of town. For the first time, Frank Baker's name appeared on the Baha'i roll. In November 1926, following Sarah's death, Dorothy was elected to the LSA of the Baha'is of Buffalo in a by-election, her first administrative position after having been a Baha'i for 14 years. Well, they had to move. They could no longer stay there. So they looked for a place to go to, and they ended up going to a place that, like in the boondocks at the time, close to Chicago, was Lima, Ohio. A place apparently where some of the gangsters in Chicago used to escape from Chicago. They would go to Lima. But she never dreamt that, because she wanted to go to California eventually, she never dreamt that that's where what they were going to spend the rest of their life. So here they are. They lost Sarah, and she's becoming now a bit more active in the faith because she already has an administrative role. All right. So the story of the, I mean, not to summarize too much, but basically they taught so well and so much in that place that so many people became Baha'is in that community. And apparently over 30 of those Baha'is down the years went pioneering, to tell you what kind of people they taught. And because they were so successful, they were basically harassed and persecuted by the preachers in town. It was awful. I mean, I never heard of a place in US that was attacked by the preachers. At one point, they even tried to boycott his bakery, his food. I mean, they were going broke. They wouldn't buy from them. So anyway, and it turned out, just to summarize it, what I remember from reading, that there was no way out. I mean, she wrote to Shawki Effendi, and he tried to explain to them that they had to sort of just be there and teach that something will eventually happen. And when she met Martha Root at one point, that came through there, I guess, in talking to Martha Root and who she was and the kinds of things she said to her, gave her enough courage to go and try to speak to the clergy. And they even went on a radio broadcast and all that. And through those actions, the tide turned, and people became a little bit more accepting of the Baha'is. And somehow those years of suffering and persecution, because of the success they had in teaching, went by the wayside. That was over. But that was her community, and they had done an amazing job. So she, at one point, even she discovered that she had a spot in her lungs, and she thought she had tuberculosis, and she almost thought she was going to die. And there was a very touching moment when she almost was expected within a year that she was going to disappear. She was afraid she was going to leave her husband again without a mother and all that. And somehow that passed, and she was able to continue working for the faith without any problems. At one point, she started to leave towards the convention in the Wilmette, and she gave a public talk at the foundation hall before they had built the superstructure of the house of worship. And her eloquence and knowledge so profoundly impressed everyone that she found herself flooded with speaking invitations. After the threat of tuberculosis was passed, and after she had weathered an attack of food poisoning, which almost killed her, Dorothy threw herself into Baha'i study and teaching. She decided that duty was to give forth living, spirited thoughts, so she developed speaking techniques, breathing, posture, elocution, a fund of humorous stories, a well-directed glance, but the unique quality she had that she could not have learned anywhere, came from the depths of her soul, was constant sincerity. When she began giving classes at Luhallen Baha'i School in Michigan, her students adored her. Margaret Rue, who remembered when she was a kid of Dorothy, she says she just burst upon us. Margaret was 15 when she first met Dorothy. She had been a Baha'i since infancy, but she had never experienced anything like Dorothy. like her classes. She said she was poetic, she was picturesque, she was graphic. The words just flowed from her mouth. We used to sit spellbound at her feet. She had told the Ruth that the reason she threw herself so ardently into Baha'i talks was that she hated housework. I mean, she was joking, but basically, you know, I can't stand that. How could housework compare with the passion and drama of Baha'i history and the poetry of Baha'i scriptures? Dorothy memorized passages and prayers from the Baha'i writings and stated them in her beautiful voice with clarity and precision. She made their gem-like quality apparent so her hearers could receive them with reverence. And Margaret Ruh kept saying she loved people and people loved her. She talked a blue streak and always wanted to know everybody's last name, profession, course of study, parents' names. I can remember at meetings and conferences and conventions and the institutes, frequently after the formal part of the meeting was over, Dorothy was off in a corner talking with a person who needed special help or visiting with someone who needed to gain more knowledge of the faith. She was very, very sensitive to people's personal needs. Her level of activity increased at one point tremendously when Mother Beecher came to live with them, and at one point when she was upstairs, I guess got up and fell and broke her hip. And because she was so old, she didn't survive and she passed away. And so as soon as that happened, the service and the travels and the teaching of Dorothy just took off like Sputnik, you know, because, you know, the grandmother was the one that was doing all the work. Now, she had a problem at one point with the success she had in teaching. And she knew there was a major hurdle that she had to overcome. And let me just see if I can find the passage that speaks of it. Let's see if I can find it. I thought that was pretty well organized, but I guess I'm not. It's okay, excuse me. She was at one point she felt very inadequate and she had to leave I guess it's convention hall, and she walked over to the lake, and she just felt very bad. And somebody joined her, a certain Baha'i, very active Baha'i called Albert Vale. And so he looked at her and she said, "Dorothy, are you willing to leave this world without rendering some great service to the cause?" So she was looking at the lake, and she looked back at him, and by that time he was gone. So Doris McKay, who was a friend of hers, having left the meeting to find her young friend, joined Dorothy in her walk, and Dorothy's heart was tortured by her own failings. She said, "Doris, I'm a spiritual criminal. I have lived and committed." In a letter written later that spring to Lorna Tasker, who was then busy with work at Greenacre, Doris described her time with Dorothy. She said, We walked to the shore of Lake Michigan, and Dorothy beat herself with self-reproaches. I urged her to draw near to God and forget her crimes. Sometimes she smiled, and it was like a nearly drowned person fighting her way back to life. There was a little shrine outside the convention hall, a little oasis in the structural wilderness of columns and beams, a small table covered with a gold and black satin cloth on which had been placed a vase of pink roses. This was near the spot where Abdu'l-Baha had laid the cornerstone. In front of the table was a bench covered by a Persian rug. I sat on that bench with Dorothy. Dorothy sitting like a statue, wrapped in the spirit of worship as we listened to the prayers being read by a young Negro couple who shared the nook. She wrote me after the convention. She says, the few minutes at the shrine will never be forgotten. How my throat ached. What those moments taught me cannot be put into words. I think my heart was laid at the Master's feet there. So, following her prayers, Dorothy re-entered the foundation hall, and remaining at the back of the room, Rosemary Sala, another Baha'i, recalled the moment. She says, George Latimer said to the friends assembled, there is one present whom I think we should hear speak, and that is the granddaughter of Mother Beecher. Dorothy arose and walked forward. The words just flowed, but all I was conscious of was spirit. She ended every phrase with, blessed be those who follow guidance. And when she finished, she stood like a princess. And when she walked down the aisle, she seemed to float. That was her first speech. Her preparation was hardly traditional, suffering, the promise of greater suffering still, the laying down of her life at the hands of her Lord, and finally detachment from this world and the determination to serve. From these roots sprouted her early eloquence. Anyway, she kept writing to Shoaib Effendi for ideas about children's stories, and she kept asking about pilgrimage. And every time Shoaib Effendi would say, this is not the time. If you have money, give money to the fund for the building of the house of worship. So I'm looking for the incident. I don't know why it disappeared. It's an incident that happened, and Louis Gregory was in that scene. I don't know why I cannot find it. That's when she was really worried about the problem of ego. So this is the story here. I don't know why I didn't. So in the summer of 36, following her classes at New Helen, Dorothy taught for the first time at Greenacre Baha'i School in Elliott, Maine. So after each class, the audience crowded in the front to ask questions or just to be near the well-dressed, dignified woman who radiated love and was so knowledgeable. Their adoration flowed over her as her love had washed over them when she spoke. But day by day, unnoticed, the praise began to sink in. Her classes had been good. She knew that. At last, she had done something worthwhile, worthy of recognition. When Dorothy's listeners spoke of her beautiful analogies, her apt descriptions, she thanked them, glad of their respect, admiration, glad to finally come. On the last day, the meeting room was emptying after a final round of compliments. All that week, Dorothy had noticed Louis Gregory in the back of the room. You know, Louis Gregory, of course, you know, was a member of the NSA and was named, maybe posthumously, Hand of the Cause of God. So Louis Gregory was in the back of the room. He was one of the most outstanding speakers in the Baha'i faith in America. Usually he stepped out the side door of the classroom as soon as Dorothy's talk ended. But today, Dorothy saw him walking up toward her. She busied herself with her papers, feigning an effort to order things to cover the nervousness she felt. That was a very good course, Dorothy. She was ecstatic. She wondered which parts he had enjoyed the most. She wanted to ask, but felt it might seem self-centered. She tried to collect her thoughts for a proper reply, but before she could speak, Louis Gregory continued. You thought so too, didn't you? Dorothy was sure she misunderstood, or at least she hoped so. She said, I'm sorry? He says, remember, the moment you begin to think it is Dorothy Baker who is accomplishing this work, that moment your service to Baha'u'llah ends. Horrified, she wondered how he could stand there so calmly saying those words. She wanted to deny it, to tell him he was wrong, to believe he had some hidden motive. Louis Gregory continued quietly looking at her, not with the authority she expected from a former member of the NSA, nor even with an expression of superior knowledge on his serene, dark face. It was true. Just a moment before she had felt quite content, but was it self-satisfaction or simply joy at being of service? He smiled. She blushed at the recognition that her self-satisfaction was not only present, but so strongly evident. Everyone must have seen it, all the people before whom she had been proud just moments ago. Then her embarrassment vanished, replaced by something worse. What difference did it make whether others knew or didn't? The real horror was that it was true. Driving from Greenacre along the road toward Portsmouth, Dorothy's mind couldn't leave the words of Louis Gregory. The strength she had felt from the praise of her audience dissipated instantly while standing there with him. The real source of strength, as he said, is absolute reliance on God, complete awareness of one's own nothingness, which negates individual pride, but increases individual power 1,000-fold. Dorothy had worked to cleanse the mirror of her soul, but driving through Maine's summer green, she knew without a doubt that the light the Baha'is saw there was not from Dorothy Baker, but from God's teachings. She had only turned toward the light, not created it. She at her best was a reflection, not a source. In the car alone, Dorothy made the decision never to give another talk without first begging God to strike her dumb rather than let her speak from the self. Humility, unlike the idle fancies of greatness that rush to fill quiet moments with disquieting suggestions, was not automatic. Louis Gregory was right. Vanity had to be overcome. It wasn't his words that triggered Dorothy's desire for purity of motive. She could have ignored his comments as a reprimand she didn't need, had it not been for his manner, his gentleness. He spoke to Dorothy not as one who couldn't conceive of self, but as an equal, as a human being who battled self every day. You're talking about two hands of the cross talking to each other. They didn't know it yet. He once wrote to a friend, I know it is all the will and power of Abdu'l-Baha which brought success. Every day I ask Abdu'l-Baha not to let me forget that I am dust and to acknowledge my absolute non-existence in that court. The love of Abdu'l-Baha is the sole magnet that renders life possible. The great Baha'i teacher, Martha Root, came to Greenacre for 3 days later that summer, but Dorothy was already gone. They met within a few months for the first time. I think she went to see them in Lima, Ohio. Those within a few months, in the first and only time they both met in Geneva, New York. The two of them were sitting down to breakfast. Doris McKay later told me it was such an experience to see Dorothy with her wonderful radiance and Martha with her quiet power of faith meet one another like two constellations colliding. It was such a wonderful experience. Dorothy was so humble in the presence of this wonderful Martha Ruth. Humility was needed to learn what she could from the immortal Martha Ruth. Dorothy often told people it was Louis Gregory who kept her on course, but it was Mother Beecher, who first taught her to recognize ego. In a tablet to Mother Beecher, Abdu'l-Baha wrote, "When the ray returneth to the sun, it is wiped out. And when the drop cometh to the sea, it vanisheth. And when the true lover findeth his beloved, he yieldeth up his soul. Until a being setteth his foot in the plain of sacrifice, he is bereft of every favor and grace. And this place of sacrifice is the realm of dying to the self, that the radiance of the living God may then shine forth." That week at Greenacre, Dorothy joined forces with the truly great ones on earth, those who, regardless of their worldly station, whether well known to others or not, or known only to God, wish above all else to be of service to humanity. Let me just, this is before everything that she did. I mean, her travels and her lectures in universities across the US. Let me just conclude today with just a couple of points. One is, when you teach how you dress, the appearance, one should have this one. And the other one, what Martha Ruth told her about prayer. So Dorothy always gave considerable thought and attention to her appearance. She spoke to me, I don't know who is this me, I think it's, anyway, it doesn't matter. She spoke to me of the fact that even one's manner of dress should attract the listener to the faith. She explained that she had chosen a different color and outfit for each country she was to visit, according to the nature of the people of the country as she perceived them to be. For Scotland and England, she had chosen a lovely soft gray ensemble, and for Spain, red. Certainly, Dorothy made the most of her natural charm. There was a quality of impeccability about her. She also paid attention to the details of her manner and words. One sensed that she had really studied how to express herself, how to teach the faith effectively. She didn't leave things to chance. She prepared herself meticulously for her teaching, trips, and her lectures. She carried in her suitcase considerable quantities of special mimeograph materials, answers to questions which she had prepared, ready to give to those who showed interest. She once said to me, "What is the use of God sending a soul into your life to teach if you are not ready and prepared to help him?" In speaking at gatherings of the Baha'is only, Dorothy always took pains to have small vignettes or bits of information about the faith to tell them, which they would probably not have heard before. This made her a particularly appealing speaker to the believers. She kept getting praises wherever she went, everywhere, in every country she went. The reports that came back. Now, let me just come back to why I'm lost with my, yeah. So I conclude with this discussion she had with Martha Ruth about prayer. So once, I don't know, because it is said that they met only once, so I have no idea. This is once or twice, but once Dorothy Baker asked Martha Ruth how she was able to accomplish so much in the face of so many difficulties. According to an unsigned typed document, okay, so we don't know, unsigned typed document found among the Baker papers, Martha answered, "Dorothy, when I'm faced with a difficulty, I use the tablet of Ahmad every day for 9 days, asking God in the name of that holy tablet to remove the difficulty. If I'm faced with an extremely difficult problem, I recite the tablet of Ahmad 3 times a day for 9 days. And then I'm faced with a problem that is completely impossible, and there is and can be no solution, I use the tablet of Ahmad 9 times a day for 9 days, and the problem is always solved. Okay, guys. Sorry, it was not as coherent as I should have been, but so I didn't, we stressed a lot of things in the beginning of her life before she just took off. So I guess we're not stuck with her, but that gives me a chance to next Sunday, to actually get more into you. She had a car. Her husband gave her many cars. I mean, she could drive a Pontiac or a Cadillac. She was known to be an extremely fast driver, and she scared everybody that drove with her. That's one thing that she was known for. And she would pick up hitchhikers. But she said, I never pick up a hitchhiker until I said 9 times the tablet of Ahmad. And then she pick up anybody. And there's a scene here where the last guy that she picked up that got off the car, he says, never, ever pick up somebody that looks like me, because when I came in here, my intention was to rob you and take all your jewelry. And I don't know why I didn't do it. So just look at me, and anybody that looks like me, never pick up. She was not afraid of anything. Women suffered a lot, close to death many times. But she was just a non-stop. And this is somebody that read and took notes and was so prepared. I mean, the kind of talks that you have to pick up some of her talks, They're so well written. Not only well written, but just the eloquence, the way she spoke. I mean, people just look at her, just couldn't believe. Very special. I just wish somebody had kept a video of one of her talks, I guess you can hear, maybe her voice is somewhere on the net. But I don't think at that time, in the 1930s, when she passed away in 1954, I don't think anybody recorded. Too bad.